Can you see and hear everyone?
I can.
Okay, good.
That was the right question.
All right, everyone, thank you for joining us for another episode of Displacement Podcast. And it so happened that this is our 1 year anniversary and we're doing something big. And we're here with Paul at CPR ID Motors. And we're doing a special session with VP Racing. And we have Mark Klein with us.
Hi. So I started my company in 1981, and VP was founded by Steve Burns in the mid-'70s. Well, we make a range of products, leaded, unleaded, some with methanol, some with ethanol, and then we've also got some nitromethane blends. So we offer a range of products for virtually every form of motorsports racing, whether it's offshore or airplane.
Oh, wow.
Nice.
I didn't know we did airplanes as well.
Yeah, they do everything. They even do the gas car, nitro hobby cars.
Okay.
They also make fuels and so on for that as well. They also do a bunch of additives. There's a lot of other things other than just fuel that VP does as well.
So tell us the difference between methanol and ethanol, which you mentioned.
They're both great solvents and more recently used as racing fuel. Generally, we can make leaded and unleaded fuels that have the same energy or horsepower and torque output, but methanol and ethanol have some different properties, some that make it attractive to racing and some not so good. For example, ethanol and methanol have a very low boiling point. So if you were to pour those products on your hand, it would feel very cool to the touch when they evaporate. That has a benefit in that it tends to lower the combustion chamber temperatures and thus help avoid detonation. Now, some of the bad aspects of these components are that they have a very poor energy value per pound compared to gasoline. But if you've ever run either one of those products, you know that you have to almost double the amount of fuel that you're putting into that reactor we call the combustion chamber. So by virtue of the volume of these fuels that you're putting in and the lower boiling point, they not only help to prevent detonation, but in some cases can increase performance, whether it's the torque curve or the ultimate horsepower output. So before we think that that's the only answer, there are other variables as well. And you had sent me a question about some of the negatives. So one of the negatives of those products, because you have such a low boiling point, it's hard sometimes to keep heat in the engine. And then also you get a lot of product that goes by the rings, and that dilutes the oil, so more frequent services are necessary.
What do you think would be some of your, I would say, top selling products? Let's say like your top 3, top 5 that you could think of.
Well, it depends on the form of motorsport. For example, for motorcycles, the MR12 is the one that makes the most power. It's also, by the way, one of the lowest in octanes, so I'd like to get back to that since it was one of the questions. It makes the most power and therefore has become one of the most popular fuels. Also in motorsports, the T4 is another very popular product. In terms of overall popularity and across the spectrum, in drag racing, C25 is one of the most popular fuels. It's also become one of the very popular fuels in the extreme nitrous applications. And we can talk about that when we discuss volatility and RVP. You know, for for the average consumer, the 110 and C12 fuels, and in the unleaded market, which has, by the way, become bigger than the leaded market as we've gotten newer engines that have both oxygen sensors and catalytic converters. And those products would be the Performance Unleaded 100 octane, the Motorsport 103.
MS109 is one of those too, isn't it?
That was the next one that I was going to mention. MS 109 is popular for both leaded and unleaded applications because it's very high in octane, and equally important, it's very high in oxygen-bearing compounds. That makes it both sensitive to storage, but good at making horsepower.
Yeah, here there was the one person that was really using that was one of the rally cars that were brought in. There was an XWRC car, and that was what they had the car running on here.
Yes. It's a very popular rally fuel. Probably the most popular rally fuel, especially in international competition.
Is that what they use in the US rally? I know it's like Subaru Rally Team USA, and they use VP fuel.
Yes, the Motorsport 109 used internationally as well as domestically.
So this one is a more specific question for you, Mark. Drag racing is really big here in Antigua, and for somebody like me who has like a weekend warrior Honda, it's a K20 motor. I've been kind of up and down about what type of fuels to use. So from one side you're hearing, okay, you know, use Q16 because that's something a lot of folks have used around here. But as you've been talking about ethanol fuels and all of this, we're thinking more about C85. If you were to do a matchup between, let's say, Q16 versus C85 for a turbocharged setup, you know, what would you think would be some of the advantages or disadvantages of either of those fuels being matched up?
Sure. So I have to ask you a little bit more about your specific engine and about the fuels that you've been running so that I don't need all the history.
All right. So what specifics do you need in terms of like if it's turbocharged?
Pardon me. Do you have an oxygen sensor?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Do you have a catalytic converter on this? Okay. Naturally aspirated?
No, turbocharged.
Turbocharged. Okay. And the fuels that you have tried in the past?
So basically I drive it around on pump, but when I'm ready to race, I want to have something in there that I know will make power, but make power safely.
Okay. So the reason I asked the last question is, without asking you any or all of the modifications, which might be anything from pistons to cylinder head work to bigger turbochargers, if you're able to run pump gas, it tells me approximately what your octane requirements are. And so knowing that gives me a better
idea in terms of
idea of which way to direct you. First, because you have an oxygen sensor, we don't want to introduce leaded fuel into the motor unless and until the unleaded fuels can no longer satisfy the detonation requirements of your motor. So because you can run 93, that makes it easier. But let me just expand on that last point. Because the leaded fuel will impact the O2 sensor, and if you have it, the CAT, and also because the late model spark plugs tend to be very fine wire, on the electrode, they can become fouled or shorten the life expectancy using the leaded fuels. Now, if the unleaded fuels, like the 109 that we talked about before, cannot control detonation, which is simply stated abnormal ignition, then ruining an O2 sensor is a lot cheaper than putting a hole in a piston.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yep.
I mean, maybe 80 bucks.
So before I go off on another tangent about octane and abnormal ignition, your car would be a good candidate for any of the unleaded fuels. starting with the C9 or the performance unleaded. Those would be my two top choices. I wouldn't jump right to the Motorsport 103 or Motorsport 109 for a couple of reasons. First, the 100 octane is going to be more than enough so that the sensors on your car will never detect detonation. And because you haven't made any modifications, the octane may be irrelevant. You've already said that you've got enough with 93, but the sensors may say, well, I've got more, but I hear detonation with that 93. You may never hear it because the sensors, which pick up a frequency known as detonation, say, all right, that's the max boost I can give you. That's the max timing I can give you. And that's the best air fuel mixture that I can give you. But if you put the 100 in, you're going to notice a difference for a couple of reasons. First, the sensor is no longer going to hear any of that detonation or any of those problems. So the O2 sensor and the computer has a duty cycle, and it might be this wide. And 93 may put it here, but a lot of the guys will disconnect the battery so the computer doesn't have any bad memory, and it goes right to the top or halfway and says, I don't hear anything, I can go a little further. If it has to relearn it, it's a little bit of a slow process, but I'm talking a couple of times when you're in the throttle. We're not talking a long learning curve, but a lot of my customers used to come in and disconnect their battery because they wanted to erase any bad memory. So the thing goes right to the top and says, I didn't hear anything. I can run there all the time until I have a bad experience.
Understood. All right, nice. I mean, no.
Stop me anytime if I'm giving you too much.
Oh, that's the type of information that we're looking for, to be honest.
What in general, I mean, you guys would know from the fuels that I've brought in or purchased from you guys and brought in here. The what we used to see a lot more, probably I would say over the last 10 years, there's been a gradual shift from, C16, Q16, C12, C10. Those were kind of the popular fuels that everybody was using. In the last maybe, I would say 6-7 years or so is where a lot of people have started to gravitate towards the ethanol and alcohol fuels. A couple of the guys here, the old school guys that used to run, were running on methanol, but those are pretty much outlaw cars. But yeah, as we've seen time go on, and as you guys have seen from the orders, I would say it's over 50% of the people buying racing fuel now are buying the alcohol-based fuels. Partly for cost effectiveness, partly because it's kind of what's the standard that's used in a lot of the classes that people follow the regulations when they do their builds. And it's what the tuners are basically comfortable with, or what we see in our region. Aside from that, as you know as well, we have a couple of people that have been running some of the nitrometh, the 50/50, with good results that way as well too. But I think you can kind of speak a little bit to that more of what would be the benefit of like between M1, M5 and the 50/50. Because from as far as I'm aware, basically the M1 will basically be pure methanol. M5 is 95% methanol, 5% nitro kind of mix. And then your 50/50 is obviously 50% nitro, 50% methanol. On that side of it, am I right in saying that? Or can you give us a little bit more information on that and what the differences are with them really?
Sure. You've asked me a broad spectrum of questions. I'm going to go with the most recent first. The M1 is indeed 99.9 minimum purity methanol. The M5 does contain 95%. The balance of 5% are power making components, which includes some nitromethane. And the 50/50 is in fact 50% nitro, 50% methanol. a couple of things to remember. First, one of the negatives of methanol that I didn't discuss before was it tends to be difficult to breathe, makes your eyes burn, and the old school guys and the door slammers that run the methanol, a lot of guys would put scent in their methanol, which made it easier to live inside the car and be able to breathe. I don't recommend the scents because it just makes something that's not good to breathe easier to breathe. The 5% methanol M5 is a very nice little power boost. Nitromethane is such a good oxygenate. It produces or releases, I should say, so much oxygen. You can actually run an underwater engine on nitromethane because it releases so much oxygen that it can keep running. So let's talk about that reactor, the combustion chamber. To make, I like to say, to make horsepower, you need air, fuel, spark, and I oftentimes add money. So it's easy to put more fuel into the motor, generally speaking. A bigger injector, more fuel pumps, so on and so forth. But in order for the engine to run properly, you need corresponding or correct amount of air. And that's the hard part, getting the extra air in there. It could be with camshafts, it can be with valves, it can be with bigger displacement, turbocharging, supercharging, and chemical supercharging. And that's where products like the nitromethane and the Q16 that you mentioned before give a racer an advantage. Because when you can bring in a component with the fuel that can release oxygen, now, as long as you have the spark and the dollars to pay for the failures when you push the limits, you can make horsepower. One of the reasons that the nitro cars in recent years have gotten so much faster is the ignition systems as well as the components to tolerate these extreme cylinder pressures. But if you put 50% nitromethane in a stock car, first of all, 50%, generally more than about 3%, won't mix or stay suspended in a typical fuel. Methanol, obviously, you can suspend greater portions of nitromethane, but as you get into the greater percentages, you have to have the ignition system that can ignite it. So you had asked me earlier about running C85. C85 is a great choice for a car that's set up to run ethanol or methanol. You've got the bigger injectors. You're able to run in those, your components are set up to run the extreme temperatures and extreme cylinder pressures. And C85 is essentially the minimum amount of ethanol to call it an 85% and the maximum amount of power components in that additional 15%, which include nitromethane and our unleaded fuels, the C9 to be precise. So I might have gotten so far afield that I didn't respond to your earlier question about the Q16 and the C16. Again, a lot of the race cars now, unless they are, as you referred to earlier, the old school guys and cars, which I resemble, all of the new stuff is unleaded. The combustion chambers are better. You don't need the higher octanes that we used to use in those earlier combustion chambers. We've got the electronic controls. We've got injection systems. We've got direct injection systems that have made a huge difference. the bigger ignition systems, all of those things have contributed to reduce the need for octane in these motors. And so as a company, I'm not selling as much of the leaded product that I used to. And in fact, even at my racetracks, some of the tracks, we've had to reverse the tanks. So the big tanks that used to contain the 110 and the C12, we need that for the 100 octane and the C9, and the smaller tanks with the leaded fuels.
So I guess similarly to what Paul is saying, I mean, there's been a change in the landscape of motorsports altogether, particularly, I guess, for maybe drag racing for us and the different motorsports that you guys participated in on your end too. So it's good to see.
GI motors don't need much octane at all unless they are extremely modified.
Those are like the newer engines, the GDI, the direct injection.
Yeah.
Yes.
So like the newer Civics, like Dario, all of that.
Yeah.
Much like the rotary engines in the Mazda. Now, there are benefits to using race fuel, but again, in those cases, you want to use fuels that have a lower octane number, but a good energy or BTU value.
With talking about that, so I know you were talking about RVP and some other stuff there earlier, and like specific gravity, and those are kind of the specs. If people go online and they want to look at, well, what fuel you're kind of new and you're trying to figure it out, obviously speak to your tuner and all that other stuff first for their experience. But if someone's looking for their own and trying to just do their own research, what do those numbers really mean? I mean, I know you can get very detailed with it, but in general, like if you explain specific gravity and those things, and what are the benefits of seeing higher and lower numbers for each of those?
Sure. Well, I'll start with specific gravity because it's the easiest to explain if you use the visual of filling a column with fuel, and just imagine this column, or call it a vase if you like, and fill it halfway up, and imagine that it holds from top to bottom a gallon, and you fill it halfway up, and you put it at 60 degrees, it's halfway. You put it out in the sun, and the fuel grows, and now it's at the top of the column. All right, if a gallon of this fuel weighed 6 pounds, and you put a half of gallon in here, you put it out in the sun, it goes to the top. It still weighs 3 pounds, but it's filled the column up. You put it in the freezer, it shrinks down to the bottom. It still weighs 3 pounds. So that's another way to look at the fuel density. And specific gravity, as it's listed on all of the fuels, is measured at 60 degrees. It is a ratio compared to water. So water is 1, and if you look at some of the fuels, they range typically between 0.69 and about 0.750. They are lighter than water. And that's what that number means. And it tells you the density. Now that's important because if you're jetting a motor as an engine builder, you need to know how many pounds of fuel this engine flows. And if the fuel is 100 degrees, you still need to make sure that you have an adequate amount of fuel going into that motor, or you're going to run it lean.
I have a totally non-technical question for you, Mark. What does the VP in VP racing mean?
That's a good question. Not a lot of people know that, but it represents volatile products. Volatile products.
And what does that mean, volatile products?
Most of the time we only hear those things now when they're referring to volatile organic compounds, or VOX, the fumes. But fuel is a volatile product.
Okay. And what about like the octane numbers that you mentioned before? Break that down for some of our non-technical audience, the octane levels.
Did I meet the explanation that you needed for specific gravity, or did you need more?
No, that's good.
Perfect.
One thing I wanted to point out about specific gravity, if you've ever had water in your fuel, you'll notice that it goes to the bottom. As I mentioned, the fuels are generally lighter than water, so water goes to the bottom of the drum. Nitromethane is heavier than water. So I just thought that was an interesting aspect of specific gravity, especially as it related to your nitromethane questions earlier. Methanol, by the way, and ethanol will suspend water, and that will change the specific gravity and, of course, the performance as well. Octane numbers are something a little bit more complicated, but I'll try to be brief. Octane is a measure of the fuel's ability to resist abnormal ignition. An abnormal ignition is the fuel igniting before the spark plug says it's okay. So what happens, and you can stop me at any time, because this one is a little bit more difficult. What happens in a typical 4-stroke engine, 2-stroke or 4-stroke for that matter, you've got intake valve opening, pistons coming down. It's drawing in the air-fuel mixture. Piston starts to come up. Both valves are closed. As the piston is traveling up towards top dead center, it's compressing the air-fuel mixture. The heat that's created by compressing that air-fuel mixture will ignite the fuel if the octane is not high enough to resist that heat. Now, what happens is, as the piston's coming up and creating this heat, if the fuel starts to burn, even a little, it's now creating more cylinder pressure. That cylinder pressure is now trying to force the piston back down. As long as the connecting rod's still attached, the piston says, I got to keep going up. So what happens? You're getting now more heat than was intended, because you've got the cylinder pressure and the fuel igniting. You burn ring lands, and in extreme cases, you put a hole in the center of the piston. Equally important, you're putting extra stress on the wrist pin and on the rod bearings. Of course, the main bearings as well. So that's why detonation is so
harmful, really, to a motor.
Yeah, I mean, detonation is the main thing that when you're tuning it, that you're trying to make sure you don't have any of, because if you do, your entire rotating assembly is essentially what's at risk.
That's right. And equally important, you're not contributing to the power stroke, which is when the piston is just a couple of degrees before top dead center. Now the spark plug is igniting, driving that piston down, also known as the power stroke. So if you've burnt most of your fuel load before the piston gets up there and trying to push against increasing pressure, you're taking power away. And to complete the 4th stroke, piston is driven down. Now the cycle is repeated, piston comes back up, exhaust valve opens, pushes out the spent gas, top dead center, intake valve is already starting to open and drawing a new load and repeating the cycle. This happens, by the way, in a typical 10,000 RPM engine, 600 times a second.
Wow, that's a lot of times in 1 second.
Which is why a diesel engine only operating low RPM, 2,500 to 3,200, and they use no spark plug. They are igniting the air-fuel mixture from the heat of compression only, typically 26 to 1, 24 to 1. So,
but then that's why diesel can also run away, right? If you have the fuel flow still going and you can't shut it off, then it just runs away with it.
Well, that's a problem, of course. The diesel engines are shut off using the fuel pump. You can't turn off the ignition.
Correct.
All right. I had a quick question for you, Mark, on the topic of detonation, and how that all functions. Is it safe to say with fuels, the higher the octane rating, the higher the flash point of the fuel to resist detonation? Or
No, it's not. It's and that's a great question, because a lot of times we equate higher octane numbers with more horsepower, and they're not related. In fact, as I mentioned early on, the MR12 is only about the same octane as a typical pump premium. Racing fuel, again, we want to accomplish a couple things. First, we have to stop the destructive powers of detonation. That's number one on the list, because it doesn't matter how much horsepower we can ultimately make if we're going to melt down beforehand. The components in race fuel are chosen because they have both a good energy and a good octane value. Now, one of the things that is also important is that read vapor pressure or volatility of the fuel. And if you look at the fuels, you mentioned, Paul, the C16 earlier. C16 has one of the lowest read vapor pressures of the fuels that we make. It essentially doesn't like to vaporize. Now, if you have a large cubic inch engine with a lot of boost pressure, inherently, we're going to have not only a lot of cylinder pressure, but from the turbocharger hot housing, we're going to have a lot of heat on that intake manifold side. So we want to control our the volatility of that fuel. Conversely, on that motorcycle engine, that very high revving, small displacement, or pro stock engine, high revving, even though they have high compression, you need more volatility if you're going to operate this motor at 10, 12, 15,000 RPMs. So those are some of the reasons that certain components are selected or rejected in race fuel. Octane, BTU value, volatility, all considerations.